The year was 1926. The city of Chicago was a loud and busy place, full of thick coal smoke and constant noise. Margaret White worked in a very tall stone building right in the middle of the busy streets. She was a legal stenographer. Her job was to listen to people talk and type their words onto thick white paper. She worked for a very successful law firm called Miller and Smith. Their office was on the 14th floor of the building. It was a beautiful and serious office with dark wood walls, heavy frosted glass doors and thick green carpets. Margaret liked her job very much. She was very good at it. Her fingers could move across the heavy metal typewriter keys faster than any other girl in the office. She never made spelling mistakes. She always made sure the black letters looked neat and perfectly clean on the page. It was a Tuesday evening in November. The weather outside was terrible. A freezing cold rain was falling from the dark grey sky. The wind was blowing hard off Lake Michigan, making the big glass windows rattle in their wooden frames. It was late in the afternoon, almost 5 o'clock. Most of the people in the office were getting ready to go home to their warm houses. They were putting on their heavy wool coats and pulling down their hats. They were talking loudly about the rain and how cold it was outside. Margaret was getting ready to leave too. She had cleaned her wooden desk, washed her ink cup, and covered her typewriter with a heavy cloth dust cover. Then her boss, Mr. Miller, came out of his private office. He looked very worried and tired. He walked over to Margaret's desk and asked her if she could stay late into the night. Mr. Miller told Margaret that the law firm had a very urgent job that needed to be done right away. A rich client had died a few days ago. The client's name was Arthur Blackwood. Margaret remembered him well. He was a very strange man. He did not look like the other wealthy businessmen who came to the law firm. He was very tall and painfully thin. He always wore an old black coat that smelled strongly like dry dust and dead flowers. He had pale skin, thin white hair, and very dark, staring eyes. He never smiled, and he never talked to the girls in the front office. He only talked to Mr. Miller behind closed doors. Mr. Miller said that Mr. Blackwood was interested in very strange things. He read old books about ghosts, spirits, and magic. People in the city called him an occultist. Margaret did not know exactly what that strange word meant, but she knew she did not like being near him. Mr. Blackwood had died in his sleep over the weekend. Because he had a lot of money, gold, and empty land outside the city, the law firm had to sort out his final will. The big problem was that Mr. Blackwood did not write his last wishes on paper with a pen. He recorded his last words onto a black wax cylinder using a dictation machine. Mr. Miller told Margaret that the probate court needed a typed paper copy of the recording by tomorrow morning. The lawyers from the other side of the family were coming to the office at 9 o'clock. The paper had to be completely ready and perfect. Mr. Miller handed Margaret a small round cardboard box. Inside the soft cotton in the box was the wax cylinder. It was black and shiny, with tiny invisible grooves cut all the way around it. He told her he was very sorry to keep her late on such a bad night. He promised to pay her double money for her extra time. Margaret said yes to the extra work. She needed the money badly. She lived in a small, cold apartment with her younger sister, and the winter rent was due at the end of the week. Mr. Miller thanked her with a tired smile and put on his heavy winter coat. He told her to make sure she locked the heavy front door when she finally left. Then he walked out of the office. Margaret heard the heavy wood and glass door close with a loud click behind him. She heard the metal elevator come up the shaft and take him away down to the street. Suddenly the large office was completely empty and very quiet. The only sound in the room was the heavy rain hitting the large glass windows. The wind howled loudly around the stone corners of the tall building. Margaret felt a little lonely in the big room, but she was not afraid. She had worked late many times before when the firm was busy. She took the grey cloth cover off her typewriter. It was a heavy black underwood machine. It looked like a big iron block sitting on her desk. It had round glass keys with white letters printed underneath the glass. It was a very good machine, very loud and very strong. She liked the mechanical sound it made. She went to the supply closet and brought out the large dictation machine. It was a heavy wooden box with a shiny metal arm and a round metal tube to hold the wax cylinder. She carried it carefully and set it up on the small wooden table next to her desk. She carefully took the black wax cylinder out of its cardboard box and gently slid it onto the metal tube. She had to be extremely careful. If she dropped the delicate cylinder, it would break into 100 tiny pieces on the floor, and the dead man's recording would be gone forever. Next, Margaret picked up the listening headphones. They were made of hard black rubber and thick metal wire. They clamped very tightly over her ears and squeezed her head. They were connected to the heavy wooden machine by a long, hollow rubber tube. The sound travelled from the sharp metal needle on the machine, up through the hollow tube, and directly into her ears. She put a fresh sheet of clean white paper into the top of the typewriter. She turned the black rubber roller knob to hold the paper tight and straight. She adjusted her wooden chair so her back was straight and her feet were flat on the floor. She placed her fingers lightly on the middle row of the typewriter keys. Her left foot rested gently on the metal pedal under the desk. When she pressed her foot down on the pedal, the machine would spin the cylinder and play the voice. When she took her foot off, it would stop spinning. She pressed her foot down on the metal pedal. The black cylinder began to spin around and around. At first, she only heard a loud, unpleasant scratching sound in her ears. It sounded like a sharp needle dragging quickly across dry, hard dirt. She waited patiently. Sometimes these wax recordings had empty space at the beginning before the person started talking. She kept her foot pressed on the pedal and listened to the loud scratching noise. The rain beat violently against the window panes. The large office was slightly chilly, and she wished she'd kept her sweater on. The small desk lamp cast a bright, warm yellow circle of light over her typewriter keys. The rest of the large room was filled with deep, heavy shadows that stretched across the carpet. Then she heard the dead man's voice. It was Mr. Blackwood. His voice was thin, weak, and raspy. It sounded like a man who was very old, very tired, and very sick. Margaret pressed her fingers firmly against the round glass keys, completely ready to type his last wishes. But he did not start talking about his money or his large house. He did not say which family members should get his expensive things. Instead, he took a deep, rattling breath and began to speak a long list of numbers and strange directions. The scratchy voice in her ears said, "Begin at the exact centre. Draw a straight line to 45 degrees. Hold the line firm. Push the angle down hard, 82 degrees, 112 degrees. Turn the sharp corner inside out. Margaret frowned deeply. This was very strange. But her job was not to understand the words the client said. Her job was to type them exactly as they were spoken onto the paper. She pushed the heavy typewriter keys down. The metal arms flew up and hit the ink ribbon against the paper. Clack, clack, clack. She typed the numbers and the strange words. 45 degrees, 82 degrees, 112 degrees. She typed very quickly and neatly, her fingers dancing over the glass circles. The voice on the old recording grew a little louder and stronger. It lost the tired, sick sound. Mr. Blackwood sounded very excited and awake now. He kept saying more and more numbers. He talked about angles and lines and geometry. He talked about corners folding and closed spaces opening up. He said, move the wall at 90 degrees, push it slowly to 100 degrees, open the hidden door inside the shape, break the square in half, make it a wide circle, make the circle into a sharp point, 200 degrees, 300 degrees, pull the ceiling down to the floor. Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard. The typewriter bell rang loudly with a bright ding when she reached the end of the paper line. She hit the metal lever with her hand to push the carriage back and start a new line. She was typing so fast that the quiet room was filled with the loud, constant clattering sound of the heavy machine. But as she typed the strange instructions, she began to feel sick. Her stomach felt completely wrong and upset. It felt exactly the way a person feels when they are on a small boat in rough rolling water. She felt dizzy, and her head began to throb with a dull ache. She took her foot off the metal pedal. The cylinder stopped spinning immediately. The dead man's voice stopped. Margaret took a deep, shaking breath. She reached up with both hands and rubbed her tired eyes. She thought maybe she was just very tired from working such a long day. She had been sitting in this chair since 8 o'clock in the morning. She looked down at the white paper rolling out of her machine. The black ink words were just numbers and shapes. It looked like a crazy mathematics book. She shook her head to clear her mind. She decided she just needed to finish the work quickly and go home to her warm bed. She pressed her shoe down on the pedal again. The voice came back into her ears immediately, but it did not sound like it was coming through a rubber tube from a wax cylinder anymore. It sounded incredibly clear. It sounded exactly like the old dead man was standing right behind her wooden chair. His voice was sharp, loud, and full of command. He said, "Do not stop. The angles are finally opening. If you stop the rhythm of the keys, the hounds will find you. You must keep the path open for me. Keep hitting the keys, keep building the shape with the numbers. 70 degrees, 90 degrees. Fold the ceiling away from the wall." Margaret felt a freezing cold chill run fast down her spine. The hounds? What hounds was he talking about? She did not want to type these crazy words anymore, but she was a very obedient worker, and she was starting to feel genuinely afraid of what the voice was saying. She kept typing. Fold the ceiling. 70 degrees, 90 degrees, clack, 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 clack. While her fingers worked the keys, Margaret looked up from her paper. She looked across the large, dark law office. She looked at the far corner of the room where the white ceiling met the two dark wooden walls. Usually a room corner is a very simple thing. It is just the quiet place where straight lines meet and stop. But as Margaret watched with wide eyes, the corner of the office began to change its shape entirely. It was very slow at first. The straight line where the walls met seemed to bend inward. It looked soft, like warm wax melting near a hot candle. Margaret blinked her eyes very hard. She thought her vision was playing tricks on her in the bad light of the storm. But the straight line did not go back to normal. It kept bending further and further. Then the solid corner split completely open. It did not break like snapping wood or shattering glass. It did not make any sound at all. It just folded outward smoothly, exactly like a flat piece of paper opening up into a box. Where there used to be a sharp, normal corner pointing into the room, there was now a deep, dark hole pointing far away from the room. It was an entirely new space that should not exist in the building. Margaret stared at it in pure shock. Her hands almost stopped typing on the keys. The new space was filled with a strange, sick grey light. It did not look like the dark office or the rainy city outside. It looked like a very long hallway that went on forever into nothing. The voice in her rubber headphones yelled. It was so loud it hurt her ears and made her flinch. The dead voice screamed, "Keep typing. Do not let the door close. The hounds of the angles live in the sharp spaces. They are coming right now. Keep typing the numbers to hold them back. 180 degrees. Fold the floorboards. Break the right angle into pieces." Margaret was absolutely terrified. Her heart was beating so fast and hard she thought it might break out of her chest. She wanted to rip the tight headphones off her head and run away as fast as she could. She wanted to run to the elevator, run out into the rain, and never come back to this building. But a deep, dark, heavy fear held her frozen in her chair. The voice was so commanding and powerful, and the totally impossible thing happening to the room made her feel like she was trapped inside a terrible nightmare. She felt that if she moved from her chair, she would fall over and slide straight into that new, wrong space. So, crying silently, she kept typing. Her fingers hit the round glass keys with heavy, desperate strokes. 180 degrees. Fold the floor. Break the right angle. As she typed those exact words, the floor near the tall metal filing cabinets began to change. The heavy wooden floorboards twisted in a sickening way. They curled upward and peeled back like the skin of a fruit. Underneath them there was no dirt, no concrete, and no metal pipes. There was only more of that strange, empty grey space. The room was stretching out. The walls were getting much longer than the building was wide. The boss's desk, that was usually only 10 feet away, was now 50 feet away. The large glass windows that looked out into the rainy night were shrinking into tiny squares far off in the impossible distance. Margaret started to cry openly. The hot tears ran down her pale face and dropped wetly onto her moving hands. She was crying because her human mind could not understand what her eyes were seeing. Things in the real world are supposed to stay still. Rooms are supposed to keep their normal shape. But her office was opening up like a magical puzzle box. There were new corners appearing everywhere. They were not normal, safe corners. They were sharp and pointed in ways that literally hurt her brain to look at. Some corners looked like they were pointing directly at her face and pointing far away from her at the exact same time. It made her feel completely dizzy and sick. She looked quickly at the wax cylinder machine sitting on the table. The black tube was spinning around and around very fast. The metal needle was tracing the tiny lines. The wax cylinder was very small. It could only hold about 5 minutes of sound. She knew this perfectly well. She used these machines every single day of her working life, but it had been spinning for much longer than 5 minutes now. It just kept going and going. The black wax looked wet, shiny and wrong. It looked like it was growing larger as it spun. The voice in her headphones changed again. It was no longer just Mr. Blackwood's tired single voice. It sounded like a giant choir of voices, all talking at the exact same time. They were saying thousands of numbers. They were chanting them together like a dark song in an empty church. 400 degrees, 500 degrees. Turn the inside out. Make the flat space incredibly deep. Let the angles eat all the straight lines. Margaret's hands were aching with terrible pain. She was typing as fast as she possibly could to keep up with the voices. The heavy metal typewriter was shaking violently on the wooden desk. Clack, 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 clack. The bell rang again. She slapped the metal return lever so hard it bruised the side of her hand. Her pinky finger slipped and caught the sharp edge of a metal key. A small piece of delicate skin tore right off. A bright red drop of blood landed flat on the clean white paper. She did not stop. She knew she could not stop for even 1 second. She realized something terrible. She needed to put a new, blank piece of paper into the machine. She was almost at the very bottom edge of the page. Usually this was a very simple and fast thing to do. You pull the old paper out, pick up a new sheet, and roll it in. It takes maybe 5 easy seconds. But the dead voice had told her not to stop typing, not even for a single second. She waited until she was on the very last available line of the paper. She typed the word degrees. Then, with a sudden frantic, panicky movement, she grabbed the round black knob on the side of the typewriter. She spun it as hard as she could. The finished paper flew up and out. She grabbed a blank sheet with her left hand and shoved it quickly behind the rubber roller. She spun the knob again to catch the paper and pull it down. For those 3 short seconds she was not typing. The room reacted instantly to the silence. A loud, awful noise filled the entire stretching office. It sounded like giant pieces of heavy metal scraping and grinding against each other. It was the terrible sound of a large ship breaking apart in the middle of a violent ocean. The new spaces in the room began to violently snap shut. The long grey hallway folded in on itself fast. But it did not go back to a normal room. It twisted into horrible, sharp, jagged shapes. And out of the deepest, darkest corners of the new space, something finally started to move. Margaret slammed her bleeding fingers down onto the keys. She did not even know what letters she was hitting. She just typed the numbers she heard, screaming in the chanting voices. 600, 700. The grinding noise of the metal stopped. The room stopped snapping shut. It froze in its new, twisted, broken shape. But the things hiding in the corners did not go away. Margaret could see them moving out of the corner of her eye. They were shadows, but they were not flat shadows cast by a lamp. They were 3-dimensional shadows standing up. They were made of extremely sharp lines and broken angles. They looked like giant pieces of black glass that had been shattered and glued back together completely wrong. They did not have eyes or mouths or legs or arms. They were just jagged, walking shapes of pure blackness. The voice had called them the hounds of the angles. They were moving very slowly toward her desk. They did not walk normally on the floor. They slid along the walls and crawled across the ceiling. They moved by unfolding themselves and folding themselves back up again, over and over. Every single time they moved a piece of their broken bodies, they made a dry, sharp, clicking sound. Click, clack, click, clack. It sounded exactly like her typewriter keys hitting the paper. The voice in her ears was completely frantic and panicking now. Keep the rhythm going. They are living in the sharp places. If the rhythm stops, the angles collapse onto you. They will eat you inside the fold. Type the numbers. Margaret was sobbing out loud now, tears pouring down her cheeks. There was nobody in the whole building to hear her crying. She was totally and completely alone in this impossible, terrifying place. She forced her tired, hurting, bleeding fingers to keep hitting the hard glass keys. The words printed on the paper were a total mess of random letters and numbers. Sometimes she hit the wrong key, but it did not seem to matter to the magic. What mattered was the constant noise, the physical action of pushing the keys, the steady rhythm of the machine. As long as she typed, the room stayed pushed open. The long, infinite grey hallway stretched out endlessly in front of her. The ceiling above was now a high dome made of repeating, spinning squares. The floor below was a deep, bottomless pit of falling triangles. Everything was grey, black, and completely cold. The only things that felt real in the whole universe were the heavy typewriter under her bleeding hands and the hard wooden chair she was sitting on. Her small desk was like a tiny, safe island, floating in the middle of a giant, crazy, dangerous ocean of bad geometry. The black shadows, the hounds, were getting much closer. They were sliding along the new, impossible walls. They were very big. One of them slid directly over the window glass. It completely blocked out the falling rain and the glowing city lights. It was just a massive thick hole in the air, full of sharp stabbing points. Margaret could feel a freezing cold wind coming from it. It smelled intensely like old dust and dried dead flowers. It smelled exactly like Mr. Blackwood when he was alive. She typed and typed. Her wrists felt like they were burning on a hot fire. The small muscles in her forearms were tight, hard, and cramping painfully. She had been typing continuously for hours. The round clock on the wall was completely gone. It had been swallowed whole by one of the folding corners. She had absolutely no idea what time it was anymore. It might be midnight. It might be the early morning. But there was no sun and no moon in this place. There was only the sick grey light and the moving black shadows. The wax cylinder kept spinning silently. The voices kept chanting loudly in her ears. They were talking about complex shapes that she did not know the words for. Shapes with 100 different sides. Shapes that turned inside out and went back into themselves. Margaret tried very hard not to look at the room. She tried to just look down at her moving hands, but it was incredibly hard. The impossible wrong geometry of the room pulled forcefully at her eyes. It made her feel deeply like she was falling forward over a high cliff, even though she was sitting totally still in her chair. She reached the bottom edge of the page again. She had to change the paper one more time. She was absolutely terrified. She remembered exactly what had happened the last time she paused. The hounds had moved so incredibly fast. They were already too close to her desk now. If she stopped to change the paper, they would be right on top of her in a second. She took a huge, ragged breath of the cold, dusty air. She typed the very last word on the line. Then she moved her hands much faster than she ever had in her entire life. Pull the lever, grab the knob, shove the paper, spin the wheel. She had the new clean paper in the machine. It took only 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was much too long. The loud, scraping metal sound screamed through the entire office again. The space all around her violently shifted and jerked. Her heavy wooden desk was pushed hard sideways. Margaret almost fell out of her chair onto the floor. She grabbed the sharp edge of the desk with her hands to stay seated. The black hounds lunged forward quickly. They folded and unfolded their bodies with terrifying, blinding speed. One of them landed right next to her desk, towering over her. It was huge and completely terrifying. It was a tall tower of black spikes, broken glass planes and sharp corners. It had no face, no eyes and no mouth, but Margaret could feel it looking directly at her. She could feel a terrible freezing hunger coming from it. It did not want to eat her meat or drink her blood. It wanted to pull her body into its sharp angles. It wanted to fold her up neatly until she was nothing but thin lines and invisible corners. She screamed. It was a loud, raw animal sound of pure, complete fear. She slammed her hands down hard onto the typewriter keys. She hit as many keys as she could at the exact same time. The metal type bars flew up, tangled together and jammed tightly. She frantically pulled the metal bars apart with her fingers, cutting her skin on the ink ribbon. She started typing words again. Any words. The numbers she heard echoing in her ears. 800, 900. Fold the deep space. The loud clatter of the heavy machine seemed to push the black shadow back just a little bit. It paused its movement. It vibrated in the air. Its incredibly sharp edges blurred and lost their focus. The voice of Mr. Blackwood spoke clearly in her ears again, rising high above the chanting choir of other voices. He said, "You are the bridge. The typed words are the bridge. You must hold the shape open until the very end of the cylinder. Do not let them fold you." Margaret cried bitterly and kept typing. Her hands were deeply bruised and bleeding from several small cuts. The round glass keys were slippery and wet with her warm blood and salty tears. She was typing so incredibly hard that the metal letters were punching right through the thin paper and hitting the hard rubber roller behind it with a loud thwack. She did not care about ruining the machine. She just kept making the constant noise. She became a mindless machine herself. She completely forgot about her sister waiting in the apartment. She forgot about Mr. Miller and the law firm. She forgot about the rainy city of Chicago. There was absolutely nothing left in the entire universe except the typewriter, the torn paper, the spinning black cylinder, and the jagged, broken shadows waiting patiently in the grey distance. The hallway stretched out forever in front of her. She could see perfectly identical copies of her own desk far away down the tunnel. She could see thousands of little desk lamps shining brightly in the grey fog. She saw thousands of women wearing her clothes, sitting at thousands of typewriters, all typing frantically with bleeding hands. She realized slowly that it was all just reflections of herself. The room was folded up like a giant house of mirrors at a carnival. But the mirrors were made of empty space, not glass. She was looking at herself from 1,000 different impossible angles. It made her tired mind want to completely shut down. It was way too much for a normal human to look at. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut. She decided to type completely blind. She knew the whole keyboard perfectly by heart. She did not need to see the letters to know where they were. She listened carefully to the chanting in her headphones and simply typed the numbers. She typed the strange directions. She typed the terrible, broken math that was holding the room open and keeping her alive. With her eyes closed tightly, her other senses became much stronger and sharper. She could smell the sharp, metallic smell of ozone in the air, exactly like the smell right after a lightning strike hits the ground. She could hear the awful click-clack of the hounds sliding on the wooden floorboards right in front of her desk. She could feel the icy, freezing cold radiating from their broken black shapes. They were surrounding her completely. They were waiting quietly for her to get tired. They were waiting eagerly for her sore fingers to finally slow down. Every single time she slowed down, even for half a second to breathe, the freezing cold got closer to her face. A sharp, invisible point of shadow would brush lightly against her arm, leaving a stinging, painful cut in her skin like a paper cut. She had to keep the pace incredibly fast. Faster than she ever typed in the daytime for the lawyers. Faster than what is humanly possible for hours at a time. She typed blindly for what felt like 10 years. Her entire body was completely numb. Her brain was just an empty vessel, passing words directly from her ears to her fingers without thinking about what they meant. She was just a living conduit for the dead man's strange magic. The black wax cylinder spun and spun endlessly. The sharp metal needle dug deeper and deeper into the black wax, carving away the smooth surface, pulling out the forbidden, hidden sounds. Suddenly, the loud chanting in her ears completely stopped. There was a long moment of pure, complete silence on the recording. Just the quiet, rhythmic scratching sound of the metal needle running on empty, flat wax. Margaret did not stop typing. She was way too afraid. She typed the very last words she had heard over and over again. Fold the space, fold the space, fold the space. Then Mr. Blackwood's tired, raspy human voice came back onto the recording. It sounded very far away now. It sounded like a man slowly fading away into the dark earth. He said softly, "The circle is fully closed. The angles are finally flat. The door is securely locked. You may stop the machine now." Margaret did not believe his voice. She kept typing frantically, "Fold the space! Fold the space!" The voice whispered one last time, "Stop the machine, Margaret. It is all over." Then the recording truly ended. The needle hit the very end of the black cylinder with a loud, final click. The heavy, repetitive scratching sound continued, repeating uselessly in the final empty groove of the wax. Margaret's hands hovered frozen over the keys. She was shaking violently from head to toe. She kept her eyes tightly closed. She was totally terrified that if she stopped making the noise, the shadows would consume her instantly and fold her away forever. She held her breath until her lungs burned. She waited for the terrible sound of the scraping metal. She waited for the sharp, stinging pain of the hounds pulling her into the unseen corners. She slowly, carefully took her left foot off the metal pedal. The heavy dictation machine powered down. The spinning black cylinder slowed down and finally stopped moving. The loud, scratching sound faded completely away into silence. The office was completely, perfectly silent. The only sound in the room was Margaret's ragged, gasping breathing and the steady, fast beating of her own heart. She did not hear the awful clicking of the shadows. She did not feel the icy, freezing cold wind. Very, very slowly she opened her eyes. She was sitting safely at her desk. The small lamp was casting a warm, friendly yellow light over her typewriter. The rest of the office was filled with deep shadows, but they were perfectly normal shadows. They were the regular shadows of filing cabinets, wooden chairs, and coat racks. She looked quickly at the far corner of the ceiling. It was just a normal corner, 3 straight lines meeting perfectly at a single point. It was solid, flat, and completely real. She looked out the large window. The storm was ending, but a light rain was still falling, streaking down the large panes of glass. She could clearly see the faint, comforting glow of yellow streetlights from the city far below. The infinite grey hallway was completely gone. The repeating mirror rooms were gone. The impossible, mind-bending geometry had collapsed entirely, leaving behind the ordinary, boring world she knew. Margaret let out a long, loud, shuddering breath. She slumped heavily forward in her chair, resting her sweaty forehead on the cool metal of the typewriter cover. She was completely exhausted in a way she had never felt before. Every single muscle in her body ached and burned. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in patches of dried red blood and many small, stinging cuts. Her fingernails were cracked and broken. She had not imagined that part. The terrible physical toll was real. She looked at the paper sitting in the machine. It was completely covered in hundreds of lines of text. It was a chaotic, unreadable mess of numbers, words, and random smashed letters. It made no sense at all. It looked exactly like the typing of a completely mad person. The paper resting beneath it was exactly the same, and the one beneath that. She had a thick stack of pages filled with the insane, magical instructions of the dead man. She reached up with shaking, weak hands and pulled the heavy rubber headphones off her aching ears. The pure silence of the normal room was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She could hear the wind blowing outside again. She could hear the faint, distant rumble of a train on the tracks. It sounded like normal life. It sounded incredibly safe. She stood up slowly from her wooden chair. Her legs were weak and wobbly, like jelly. She had to hold tightly onto the edge of the desk to keep from falling over onto the carpet. She looked at the wax cylinder sitting on the machine. It was completely destroyed. The sharp needle had dug so deep that the black wax was shaved entirely away, leaving only a smooth, blank, flat surface. The recording was gone. The dangerous words were gone. The impossible angles were gone. Margaret did not care about her important job anymore. She did not care about pleasing Mr. Miller or the rich lawyers coming in the morning. She knew perfectly well she could never show this strange, messy paper to anyone. They would think she had lost her mind. They would lock her up in a hospital for crazy people. And she knew she could never, ever sit in this office again. She could never look at the normal corners of the room without remembering the long grey hallway and the jagged walking shadows waiting in the dark spaces. She quickly gathered the messy typed pages from her desk. She did not read them again. She folded them roughly in half and shoved them deep into her heavy coat pocket. She grabbed her winter hat and her small purse. She did not bother to cover her typewriter with the cloth. She did not put the heavy dictation machine back in the closet. She just wanted to get out of there as fast as she could. She walked quickly to the heavy glass and wood door of the office. She opened it and stepped out into the hallway. The marble floor felt beautifully solid and flat under her shoes. The shiny brass elevator doors looked perfectly normal and straight. She pressed the round button and waited patiently. She felt a profound, deep sense of relief when the elevator arrived with a cheerful, normal ding. The elevator operator, an older man in a blue uniform, looked at her very strangely. He probably noticed her pale, sweaty face and her bruised, bleeding hands, but he did not say anything to her. He just pulled the metal lever and took her down safely to the lobby. Margaret walked fast out of the tall building and into the cold, wet Chicago night. The cold rainwater on her face felt absolutely wonderful. It felt real and grounding. She walked down the busy street, letting the rain slowly wash the dried blood from her aching hands. She did not look back at the tall building. She did not want to think about the 14th floor ever again. She just wanted to go home, lock her door, and sleep for a week. But even as she walked away, blending into the quiet crowds of people with their heavy coats and black umbrellas, Margaret knew that a small part of her would never truly leave that room. She knew that whenever she closed her eyes, she would see the impossible shapes unfolding. She would hear the dead man's voice chanting the numbers, and she would always, for the rest of her long life, be deeply terrified of sharp corners. She knew now that the real world was not solid at all. It was just a very fragile thing, held tightly together by basic rules and straight lines, and she knew that underneath those straight lines there were other, older places, dark places full of broken angles and hungry, sharp shadows. All it took was a voice, a spinning machine, and a rhythm to open the door. Margaret had locked the door tonight, but she would never forget what was waiting behind it. She would never forget the hounds of the angles, waiting patiently in the hidden geometry of the world. She kept walking steadily through the rain, her hands pushed deep in her pockets, clutching the terrible pages. The city of Chicago roared loudly around her, completely oblivious to the fragile nature of its own existence. Margaret White just kept her head down, walking only in straight lines, avoiding the dark shadows, and praying quietly to herself that she would never have to type a single word again.